In my series, Who the Fuck Is This? Specifically, we're going to talk about Libertarian presidential candidate Jo Jorgensen. So, who is Jo Jorgensen? Well, she's a fairly well educated woman, graduated from Baylor University in '79 with a bachelor in psychology. Southern Methodist University gave her an MBA in 1980, so she's a filthy accountant. And after she graduated, she basically worked in business. She worked for IBM, she started her own company a couple of times. Um, she's got a consulting company she started in 2002, which she still works with select clients. So, uh, textbook PMC person. She's been with the Libertarian Party since 1980 and apparently has voted for the Libertarian Party every time they've been on the ballot since 1980. And I'll talk about the Libertarian Party towards the. Well, no, I think here's a good point to get into the Libertarian Party. They are one of the premier third parties in America. And by that I mean they have little to no say in American politics. As you can see here, since 1972, they have never won a seat in the House or in the Senate. They do have a handful of local, state level elections to their name, mostly in nonpartisan elections. So elections where the party doesn't matter, they're just running for a position. The best they've done was Gary Johnson back in 2016, who got polled at about 13% and finished with fractional percentages of the presidential. Yeah, 3.27% of the vote in 2016. So, and a big reason for this is that they really only come out in force every 4 years to try to snag the presidential election. There have been a handful of members of Democratic and Republican parties, most famously Ron Paul, who have either once elected under the auspices of one of those two parties, renounced their membership in and rejoined the Libertarian Party, or like with Ron Paul, basically he was a libertarian wearing an elephant skin cloak. So they're somewhat irrelevant in national politics and virtually irrelevant in local politics. Which is probably a good thing. So let's go over their policies and their statement of principles. We, the members of the Libertarian Party, challenge the cult of the omnipotent state and defend the rights of the individual. We hold that all individuals have the right to exercise sole dominion over their own lives and have the right to live in whatever manner they choose, so long as they do not forcibly interfere with the equal right of others to live in whatever manner they choose. Governments throughout history have regularly operated on the opposite principle, that the state has the right to dispose of the lives of individuals and the fruits of their labor. Even within the United States, all political parties other than our own grant to government the right to regulate the lives of individuals and seize the fruits of their labor without their consent. We, on the contrary, deny the right of any government to do these things and hold that where governments exist, they must not violate the rights of any individual, namely, the right to life. Accordingly, we support the prohibition of the initiation of physical force against others, the right to liberty of speech and action. Accordingly, we oppose all attempts by government to abridge the freedom of speech and press, as well as government censorship in any form. And the right to property. Accordingly, we oppose all government interference with private property, such as confiscation, nationalization, and eminent domain, and support the prohibition of robbery, trespass, fraud, and misrepresentation. Since governments, when instituted, must not violate individual rights, we oppose all interference by government in the areas of voluntary and contractual relations among individuals. People should not be forced to sacrifice their lives and property for the benefit of others. They should be left free by government to deal with one another as free traders, and the resultant economic system, the only one compatible with the production of individual rights, is the free markets. Note, the Statement of Principles was approved at the convention in Dallas in 1974. So whatever else you have to say about Jo Jorgensen, whatever her personal policies or politics, which we'll get into here in a minute, she signed on for this Statement of Principles. Personal liberty, self-ownership, individuals own their bodies and have rights over them that other individuals, groups, and governments may not violate. Individuals have the freedom and responsibility to decide what they knowingly and voluntarily consume and what risks they accept to their own health, finances, safety, or life. So, the personal liberty is pretty okay, except there's a long-standing meme among libertarians or anarcho-capitalists, ANCAPs, of wanting to lower the age of consent in order to basically legalize pedophilia. Now, there's nothing on any of these in any of these pages which explicitly addresses the age of consent, but parents or other guardians have the right to raise their children according to their own standards of beliefs, provided that the rights of the children to be free from abuse and neglect are also protected. If you don't see what you're doing as abuse or neglect, then that is perfectly in line with libertarian principles. They are good on abortion because, well, they're kind of good on abortion. They could easily be tricked into a states' rights position, giving the right away to states, which a number of states would then ban it, as we saw. Personal relationships, sexual orientation, preference, gender, or gender identity should have no impact on the government's treatment of individuals, such as in current marriage, child custody, adoption, immigration, or military service laws. Government does not have the authority to define, promote, license, or restrict personal relationships, regardless of the number of participants. Consenting adults should be free to choose their own sexual practices. Yeah, a lot of talk about consenting adults here, probably to counteract that ongoing meme. And yeah, self-defense, they're good on that. They promote the idea of removing any restrictions or licensing to obtaining firearms, which cool. This is where we get into some real issues. Economic liberty. As respect for property rights is fundamental to maintaining a free and prosperous society, it follows that the freedom to contract, to obtain, retain, profit from, manage, or dispose of one's property must also be upheld. Libertarians would free property owners from government restrictions on their rights to control and enjoy their property, as long as their choices do not harm or infringe on the rights of others. Eminent domain, which I agree with all this, removing eminent domain and civil asset forfeiture. Governmental limits on profits are often used to prevent monopolies, which is something that somehow ANCAPs and libertarians have tricked themselves into believing. Natural monopolies would not form if we removed all regulations, ignoring the fact that it is only through these regulations that we have prevented monopolies forming in our own society. Environment. They seem to think that the free market will create create sustainable green economies and systems and techniques, and that is not upheld by. They even have private landowners and conservation groups have a vested interest in maintaining natural resources to a point. Governments are unaccountable for damage done to our environment and have a terrible track record when it comes to environmental protection. This is simply not true. The EPA is responsible for so much cleanup and so many areas being restored to usable state after the Industrial Revolution left them uninhabitable sludge areas. The one thing I do agree with them, and particularly Jo Jorgensen, on is their proposal of ending energy subsidies for the coal and gas lobby and implementing nuclear energy. We need nuclear power if we're going to do anything about uh, global warming. It it's much less dangerous to the environment than coal and natural gas, and we just need to kind of figure out what to do with the waste. And we've got a couple of ideas already in progress. So it's not, and it's nowhere near as dangerous as it was 30 or 40 years ago. And even then, it wasn't as dangerous as a lot of people seem to believe. Again, most of the people who died from Chernobyl were the people who either didn't know what was going on and stuck around longer than they should, or who went back in to try to clean it up to make sure that it wouldn't be as bad as it could have been. So, uh, nuclear energy is safe and much better for our environment. Um, they want to slash government finance and spending. They want to make sure the government should not incur debt. Uh, Any requirement that must join or pay dues to a union as a condition of government employment. Of course, they want to bust unions. Unions are one of the biggest ways of fighting back against corporate greed. Free market banking with unrestricted competition among banks and depository institutions. Free markets, no regulations, so there's nothing to stop you from selling arsenic in your chocolate. Uh, Completely eliminating licensing or registration or bonding or anything like that that we currently use to make sure that the person we're hiring to work on our home or car is actually capable of doing so. We encourage certifications by voluntary associations of professionals, but without state or federal laws to protect these, to enforce these certifications. There's no repercussions for someone lying about being licensed and doing poor work. They support sex work, which is good. Employment and compensation agreements between private employers and employees are outside the scope of government, and these contracts should not be encumbered by government mandated benefits or social engineering. We support the right of private employers and employees to choose whether or not to bargain with each other through a labor union. Bargaining should be free of government interference, such as compulsory arbitration or imposing an obligation to bargain. Basically, more union busting. And again, education best provided by the free market. The free market solves all. Achieving greater quality, accountability, and efficiency with more diversity of choice. Recognizing that the education of children is a parental responsibility would restore authority to parents to determine the education of their children without interference from government. Parents should have control of and responsibility for all funds expended for their children's education. So, in case you haven't noticed a pattern here, essentially an ideal libertarian state, although they would hate to call it a state, most of them are at least pretend to be anarchists, would be one in which wealthy people can do whatever they want. There's no restriction on what they can buy and what they can do, and poor people are forced to slave away to make the things the wealthy people want and need to eat. So right down to free market healthcare system, which anyone who is over about 20 years of age probably has some idea of what the somewhat regulated free market of the U.S. medical care system was prior to Obamacare. And they have a very interesting Social Security plan, which can be summed up as this: instead of putting your money towards a into Social Security to benefit from it when you're older, you can just put it into an IRA, and then you'll have complete control of that, uh, of what you invest in that IRA. The problem is that, for one thing, the plan that this is based off of a Cato Institute plan known as the 6.2% uh, plan, because the withholdings for Social Security are about 6.2% for each worker. So instead of taking 6.2%, instead of investing that in Social Security, you can invest in an IRA and thus have control of it. The problem is, according to the Social Security Administration, this would this would solve the Social Security's solvency issues. It would make it all that good, but it would also only work once we've already solved the solvency issue with Social Security. So it's kind of one of those things, like a lot of things they implement, a utopian idea. I'll check that out here in a minute, Dodge. Okay. Securing liberty. National defense, they basically favor an isolationist approach. Citizen soldiers who are ready to defend America but do not go out into the world uh, to make war or police the world, which I'm of two minds about, because on the one hand, I agree America is probably involved in too many foreign wars. Unfortunately, if we were to withdraw and completely leave the world to itself, take all of our soldiers, bring all of our soldiers home, then it's very likely that a combination of China, Russia, and Germany would one of those three would vie for world hegemony. And if it's China or Russia, potentially also India, just as a numbers game, but China is most likely to come out on top of that. And I don't want to live in a world where China is the world hegemony. That just does not sound like a good idea. Their authoritarianism and complete disregard for natural human rights means that we inevitably would end up uh, fighting some sort of war with them, except that they would have the rest of the nations on their side, because it would be that or be crushed under the iron boot of the CCP. International affairs should emphasize defense against attacks from abroad and enhance the likelihood of peace by by avoiding foreign entanglements. We would end the current U.S. government policy of foreign intervention, including military and economic aid. We recognize the right of all people to resist tyranny and defend themselves and their rights. We condemn the use of force, and especially the use of terrorism against the innocent, regardless of whether such acts are committed by governments or political or revolutionary groups. Fair enough. They also have very based ideas about free trade and migration. The idea that um, people should be able to move and trade freely with anyone they want. I am aware that many of our embargoes and whatnot are to prevent hostile foreign powers from uh, receiving money from businesses in America. So I'm kind of in favor of that. But, uh, you know, open borders, while would probably collapse our current economy, I think is a good end goal. And they claim to, uh, and this is why I was talking about that Michael Moreno was talking about some ANCAP ideas. We reject the idea that a natural right can ever impose an obligation upon others to fulfill that right. So this is where we get into healthcare can't be a human right because it requires people to uh, requires doctors to work on people whether they want to or not. And of course, election systems that are more representative of the electorate at the federal, state, and local levels. Um, so yeah, this is we oppose laws that effectively exclude alternative candidates and parties, deny ballot access, gerrymander districts, or deny the voters with the right to consider all legitimate alternatives. So yeah, election reform is something I can get behind, and of course, self determination, blah blah blah. You mean about trade embargoes to prevent like I could be wrong here, but what I understand is that a lot of our trade embargoes with places like uh, Iran and actually, I guess most of our trade embargoes are pretty out of date these days. So yeah, I don't. I just don't like the idea of an oppressive government benefiting from trade with America. But most oppressive governments already benefit from trade with America. So yeah, it's pointless. So yeah, the libertarian government. Well, yeah, if America isn't uh, influencing trade and foreign policy with our big stick, then China will instead. And while America's not great, it's still better than China in that respect. So moving on to specifically about Jo Jorgensen and her policies. Um, I would say it is, yes. Uh, at least in America, we pay lip service to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. We maintain uh, that the people have the right to change the government, and although our two-party system is really a two-sided one-party system, there is still the possibility of change there where there really isn't in China. So, um, I mean, again, I agree the US is pretty bad, but I think that China would end up worse if the roles were reversed. The world would end up worse if the roles were reversed between China and the US. So, Joe Jorgensen's specific vision and proposals. I've kind of got this split up into the good, the middling, and the bad. So, in the good, as I've said, environment, this is actually pretty middling, actually, now that I think about it. I will work to remove government barriers to replacing coal burning and oil burning power plants in the United States with safe, non polluting, high tech nuclear power plants and allowing off grid use of solar power. Worldwide, I believe we need to consider all scientific and economic knowledge to care for our environment, not cherry pick data to support a predetermined outcome. Ugh. Most pollution is generated in developing countries, so reducing pollution worldwide requires cost efficient, zero emission energy sources like nuclear. This is fairly true. Most pollution, well, if by developing you mean nations like India and China, but uh, yeah, I agree that we need to move towards nuclear. And then, as I also mentioned, she toes the line on trade and immigration. Freedom to trade and travel are fundamental to human liberty. As American citizens, we should be free to travel anywhere we choose and to buy and sell anywhere in the world. As president, I will use my constitutional authority to eliminate trade barriers and tariffs and work to repeal arbitrary quotas on the number of people who can legally enter the United States to work, visit, or reside. These arbitrary quotas are often used to allow people from more acceptable countries in and reject people from less desirable countries. And criminal justice reform. I am appalled that the United States ranks number one in the world for having the highest percentage of people imprisoned. I am also appalled that the federal government permits police to seize a person's assets without first convicting them of a crime and then keep most of the assets seized. This is literally highway robbery. As president, I will use my constitutional authority to end federal civil asset forfeiture prior to conviction and pardon persons convicted of nonviolent victimless crimes. I will also work with Congress to end the failed war on drugs and other victimless crime laws. So, I can agree with most of this. I think this is some good stuff about reforming the criminal justice system. That's what this whole George Floyd rebellion, all these protests are about. That the criminal justice system needs some changing, needs to be torn down and rebuilt from the ground up. Unfortunately, that's really where the good stuff ends. Government spending, deficits, and debt is a little good, a little bad. So, as president, I will use my constitutional authority to block any new borrowing. I will veto any spending bill that would lead to a deficit and veto any debt ceiling increase. I will give every cabinet secretary a specific spending reduction target to meet and hold them accountable. There is simply no excuse for sticking our children and grandchildren with the bill for these bipartisan bloated budgets. Which is fine. That's certainly an admirable goal to veto any budget that includes a deficit. But then we come down here to taxes. Taxes are never voluntary. They are always paid under threat of punishment. If you fail to pay what government says you owe, you can be fined, have your wages garnished, assets seized, even go to prison. Voting for more government spending inevitably leads to higher taxes to pay for it, now or in the future. As president, I will work tirelessly to slash federal spending, make government much, much smaller, and let you keep what you earn. So, this, combined with the stated Libertarian Party goal of reducing government or military involvement worldwide, that in itself would reduce our government spending tremendously. But one thing that isn't talked about here is how much she would cut federal spending programs, specifically in regards to welfare and the like. From 1959 to 1969, the poverty rate was nearly cut in half, while government did little to address poverty. However, after the war on poverty was fully implemented in the early 70s, progress stopped. 50 years of federal anti-poverty programs, zero impact. Government anti-poverty programs don't work. The real cure for poverty is a vibrant economy that generates plentiful jobs and high wages, combined with an affordable cost of living. As president, I will work to eliminate policies that cripple economic growth. I will give special attention to regulations driving up the cost of housing and healthcare, as well as those creating barriers to creating new businesses or entering professions. Finally, I will work to repeal laws and regulations that prevent individuals and charitable organizations from helping those in need. So essentially what she wants to do here is stop spending on government programs to help people and leave that up to the free market. And also remove regulations which prevent companies from growing. And somehow, in doing this, we will not end up all belonging to Amazon Corp, all hailing the eternal leader Jeff Bezos, but will instead result in a vibrant panoply of different small businesses run by go-getter entrepreneurs, where people can work until they have enough money saved up to start their own small businesses. Because that's how capitalism has ever worked. And as I already talked about Social Security, although I do find this, I'm pretty sure this is a direct quote from George W. Bush, that they spent every cent in the Social Security Trust Fund on other spending, leaving behind worthless IOUs. Their government T-bills, they're some of the most valuable non-paper note currency in the nation. But sure, they're just worthless IOUs. Um, so again, this Cato 6.2% solution, according to even the Social Security Administration, it would work, but first they need to get the Social Security Administration back into the solvent territory before they can implement it. Because one of the biggest issues is that wealthy people will already have IRAs. Like, this would just be an additional IRA, which they get to control. Poor people don't have IRAs. So this would force them to basically be reliant on the market, specifically the stock market, to have anything left for retirement. And that's not always a good idea. And obviously, one of the benefits of the Social Security Administration, one of the reasons it was implemented, was to give all workers an option, the capability to have something to live on once they can no longer work, because the 1929 stock market crash had demonstrated that relying on the market for your retirement means that you're one bad day away from losing everything. So while this might be a good idea, again, it pegs everything to the stock market. So, it could be a good idea, but it's not possible to implement at this time. And of course, healthcare. What do you expect? Free market. Just let the insurance companies duke it out. Government hands off. No regulations. No stepping in. No nothing. Just free market all the way. And somehow she's gotten into her head that the Department of Education has failed. That they are somehow responsible for the increase in the cost of education. That the for-profit college programs, which have just gone up and up and up every year, is somehow the fault of the government, of the Department of Education, and not just how capitalist markets work. When college became a market economy and there started to be people on the in these colleges who basically, the college existed to keep making money for the people who owned the college, then it stopped being something that people could benefit from and started being a business model. And this also goes into her talk about poverty. It's worth noting that due to a variety of situations, wages pretty much started stagnating in the 70s. So whether we can blame that on government programs or if they're just a part of the problem, the real issue with poverty starting in the 70s was that you no longer got the same amount for working the same hours. You got less and less as time went on. So I also wanted to go over her. All of these are just little sound bites, except for neutrality and peace. With the military force to defend America's shores and soils against any foreign attackers or invaders, protected by an armed citizenry and by a military laser focused on defending America. No U.S. involvement in foreign wars. Bring home our 200,000 plus American military personnel stationed in foreign countries. No U.S. military aid to foreign governments. No U.S. blockades or embargoes on non military trade. Peace. And then she's got this whole page of sound bites. Turn America into one giant Switzerland, armed and neutral. The thing about Switzerland is that it's small and pretty centrally located, and also, if I remember correctly, landlocked. Yeah. Yeah, so it kind of has to be neutral in order to survive so that it can trade with its partners. Because if it cut off Italy or France, like if it pissed them off, then all of a sudden they don't have access to deep water ports, and they could easily be starved in the air if it got to that point. So Switzerland's neutrality is, uh, especially in the pre-modern era, basically a function of survival. Oh yeah, Swiss banks are infamous for serving anyone who will have them. They make no uh, uh, claims about only working with good people. They'll work with anyone with the money, which from what I understand is actually kind of a problem because you can put uh, assets in a Swiss bank and they disappear. There's no government force on Earth that can get those resources out. So I'm sure there's a number of international criminals who, or local criminals with resources who get out of prison and go straight to a Swiss bank and start over with all the resources they stole if they were able to get them in the bank quickly enough. With all the military force needed to defend America's shores and soil against foreign attackers or invaders, armed and trained, able and ready to defend the life, liberty, and property of Americans against foreign aggressors. National defense means defending our nation, our country, the United States of America. Military self defense for America is a good and necessary thing. Our country could not exist without it. Unfortunately, for the last 70 years, most elected Democrats and Republicans in Congress and the White House voted for and supported actions and policies and laws and taxes that made America far less defended, far less safe, and far less free. And she's not wrong there. Um, and I do think there could be something. So, my issue with this citizen soldier thing is that a lot of discussion around citizen soldiery is used in sort of the Starship Troopers. This was a proposal made by Pete Buttigieg that every citizen would have to serve some sort of military service, whether it was active bang bang shoot military or more community community service type stuff. And while I actually don't disagree with that as an idea, the problem is that if I remember correctly, the way he proposed it was more of a if you didn't serve, then you were looked down as a lesser class of people. And as an anarchist, I dislike systems which create uh, privileged classes in and of themselves. Gotten us into and kept us in foreign wars and foreign countries for foreign interests. Yeah. So this is all just railing against the military-industrial complex of the United States, which, honestly, there's nothing really here that she has proposed that would actually do anything um, to reduce the actual military-industrial complex. She's talking about bringing people home, but like, how do we reduce the military from where it is now? Do you have a plan for that? How do we make it so that it doesn't just become the police force at home? There's a lot of issues with just pulling everything back, even ignoring the potential ramifications of a power vacuum of American military leaving various areas around the world, and America no longer exerting its socio-political influence around the world, backed up by that military. So, all in all, Jo Jorgensen has some good ideas, but the Libertarian Party uses a lot of fancy, flowery words to basically reinforce the worst parts of the status quo and eliminate the best parts of progression we've made in the last 30, 40 years. So I've seen a lot of people I love and care for promoting Jo Jorgensen as an alternative to our uh, turd burger and shit sandwich candidates which we have here. But unfortunately, there's just no way a third party is going to win a presidential election. There are too many people out there who do not pay attention to anything other than what CNN or MSNBC or Fox News tells them, and they're not going to say anything about the Jill Steins, the Howie Hawkins, or the Jo Jorgensens of the world. Now, I know that that sounds like a just do what the system tells you, but I'm speaking from harm reduction here. If we don't work to elect the most electable candidate put forth, then potentially the fascist stays in office. So while I don't like Biden, I dislike Trump a whole lot less, or I dislike Trump a whole lot more. Excuse me. And Jo Jorgensen just isn't even on the radar. Maybe if they push more local issues, they can get a foothold there. But that doesn't seem to be their course. They just keep trying to hammer a presidential candidate through, and that's not going to work without some serious uh, ground game. And yeah, third parties aren't impossible or not viable if they started now for 2024. Yeah, exactly. Put all your effort into getting the name out for 2024. Forget 2020. That's over. We got our shit sandwich and turd burger choices. It sucks, but that is the system we live in. And remember, as bad as Biden is, we're functionally electing the Democratic Party to the White House. And of the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, only one has made any even pretend mentions of election reform. If you want electoral reform, vote Biden. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.